Welcome, everybody, to a special edition of the Drive and Dish NBA podcast. My name is Kevin Rayfuse. Of course, joining me as always is my co-host Justin Kuzar, but Justin is off tonight. But nevertheless, I say special edition because we have a special guest on the program, second time on the podcast. It's been, I'm not gonna lie, I thought it was maybe like 4 or 5 years ago, but it's quietly been since 2017. Mr. Adam Krieble, though, joining us on the podcast again for a second time, Southeast Missouri State history professor and the author of Tall Tales and Short Shorts, which is the last time we talked to Adam, which is that book was about the 70s. So we went in detail about that if you want to go back to it. But the reason Adam is here today is the new book, Kings of the Garden, the New York Knicks and Their City. I got it up here on stream right now, my copy. It's all hardcover and official and everything. Adam, as course, as an author, I'm sure nothing makes you happier than seeing the print copy too. Finally, seeing all your hard work come to fruition there. And, I'm really excited to bring Adam back on because this was a great read. I love Tall Tales and Short Shorts, and I really enjoyed this one as well. Kings of the Garden here. And of course, the first book was about the 70s. And this book here is mentioning a fair amount in the 70s, kind of mid 70s all the way to 1985. But the one thing that was unique is this starts kind of after the Knicks win their two titles in the 70s. And then talks about kind of that transition era going all the way up to Patrick Ewing. So as we get into it, with Kings of the Garden, what made you want to hone in on this topic? Why did you write this book?
Great question, Kevin. First of all, thanks for having me. I appreciate being on again. It's like you said, it's hard to believe it's been 7 years since since Tall Tales and Short Shorts came out. And this book actually came from something as I was researching that book. There was a single phrase, a single sentence in an article written by Peter Vesey in 1979 about the New York Knicks. And it was kind of a throwaway editorial. I wasn't able to work much of it into the book, but he used the N-word when talking about the all black NBA's New York Knickerbockers of 1979 and 1980. And so that was when I filed away and just said, hey, that'd be interesting to kind of research more about that. And why did he use that phrase in describing this team? Of course, it was an all black team, but was that okay? And so I began doing some more research. And as I dug, I also found that not only is that the first all black team in the NBA, but also this is a time in New York City that just a lot's going on. Like rap and hip hop is emerging from the South Bronx. We see that the team on the court isn't great all the time, but it's a really interesting team. There's a lot of colorful personalities. And so that got me kind of doing some more research. And then, 4 or 5 years later, I was writing a book about it. And it's taken a couple years to get to see the finished product. But yeah, it came out of the research I did for Tall Tales and Short Shorts.
Well, and going off that, you mentioned a little bit as well with that era, you mentioned with hip hop coming out of the South Bronx and really coming to life in the late 70s and early 80s. But the book goes into way more than that. It talks about, you mentioned New York City itself, how it looked in the movies. You talk about the politics a little bit. And it is because I know we as Americans now with New York City, you always have such a refined image, a polished image, like it's the ultimate cosmopolitan city. It's the biggest city in America. It was a radically different in the 70s, especially in certain boroughs, especially the Bronx, more uptown in Manhattan. Like it just was a worse place to live. It's come a long way. And I think the book talks about that and what it took to get there. But when you talk about this era, I guess, what would you say are some of the more defining characteristics of it?
Sure. So as you said, there's a lot going on. There's a lot going on within the municipality. So this is a time when New York City is on the verge of bankruptcy. And there's some kind of, I guess as a historian, it's hard to tell what's actually well known and what's not, but fairly well known line that Gerald Ford comes and visits the South Bronx, and plastered across the headlines the next day is Ford to city drop dead, because Ford is not going to give a lot of federal assistance to help this city. And so there's a lot of fear in New York City. The term that I think best describes this era, at least the late 70s, is gritty. So this is a time when there's a lot of movies that are made that's just the best term to to use to describe them. And they're movies that are now, 45 or 50 years old, but still, some people know, like Taxi Driver is a good example. The Warriors, these films that just show how rough New York City is at the time. And it's a period of transition as well in places like, so Times Square. It's where all the tourists go. For your first time in New York City, you have to go to Times Square. Well, at the time, there was a huge sex worker trade there. There was neon signs advertising anything. This was not a family-friendly location in the late 70s and early 80s. And the Knicks are in the middle of that. And so they're part of the story that, you can't really separate and just say New York City was this way, but the Knicks were that way. And so I found that they were intertwined. And so I wanted to tell a story that included both the story of the Knicks and also the story of New York City in this era.
I think, and that is the one thing that is so unique about the Knicks compared to, because with New York, every sport has to, and I mean the NBA does too with the Nets in Brooklyn, but with all these other teams have been there for a while, even with the Jets coming around in the 60s with the Islanders, like there was always that split. And sometimes it varies geographically. Like, of course, with hockey, it's a little more with Long Island goes one way, New York goes the other way. That is like truly the one thing with the Knicks is that everyone in New York just lives and dies by that team. And I think that's one of the real appealing things about New York fans is that because the team frankly hasn't given them a lot to cheer about. Like there have been good eras of New York basketball, of course, and which you talk about briefly at the end with Patrick Ewing, more recently with Carmelo Anthony in the early 2010s. But there have been a lot of up and down times too, which I think you do a great job of addressing here in the book. Some of these players, I think what I love when I read about this era is you get to hone in on, more the underrated and forgotten about guys. And so, from this era, of course, we know the Earl Monroes and the Walt Fraziers. But then I think about guys more like the Spencer Haywoods and the Truck Robinsons and the Bernard Kings of the world. Did you have a particular player from any of these Knicks teams that you either just feels deserves more shine or that you maybe loved researching about more than others?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I've got two answers to that. One is I was fortunate enough to talk to about 18 or 20 players from the era. And I actually became pretty close with Jim Clemens, who came over to the Knicks when Walt Frazier went to the Cavaliers in 1977. And so he'll hold a special place in my heart because again, we got to be buddies and chatted and texted back and forth for a couple of years. But as far as the on-court thing, one player that stood out that I had never heard of before doing research on this was a guy named Toby Knight. So Toby Knight was one of those, like, he was a small forward, but he could slide down and play the four. He was maybe 6'7", 6'8". The couple years that he played, he was, he got to be an 18, 20 point a game scorer, slashing small forward, then blew out his knee. And so there was a moment where they had a really young, dynamic team that he was an important part of. He'd been a first-round draft pick out of Notre Dame, blew out his knee, and never really came back full strength, and the team struggled. So he went from a guy that was not on my radar at all to one of those. Wow, he was a legit baller for a couple years for the Knicks. So those were a couple of the guys that stood out to me beyond what you said about, like, everybody knows the Walt Frazier, Earl Monroe guys of the world.
I think what was it? My favorite description, and I feel like it was in this book as well, but I know it was in the last book, was the Rolls Royce backcourt with the Knicks. I think that was always one that just stuck out. But you're right, such a just fun era overall, and that's why again I love diving back into the 70s. And there's just so much more parity in that era. And I guess that's the one thing, I know this book is focused on the Knicks themselves, obviously, and that's one team, but there are so many, they played such a variety of teams over this period, and there were different teams that were up and down. There was never that, traditional dynasty. I guess, which of these Knicks matchups I think I guess do you think was the most fun in hindsight? Like the one that stood out to me, I guess, that was the most fun learning about here in the book more. It comes a little later. It was in '84. I loved hearing about that early series with Detroit because, of course, we know what Detroit would go on to be with the Bad Boys and all that. But do you have another one that really just going back and watching the footage in hindsight, you think is just great?
Yeah. So I've watched a lot more, old games, Tuesday night games from the 70s and 80s than I think any person reasonably should. Uh, the games that stuck out to me. So again, two answers. One is the '84 playoffs against the Boston Celtics. So everybody remembers the mid '80 Celtics as this dynasty that really it was just them and the Lakers for the most part. But the Knicks gave them all they can handle in '84, and there was a back and forth. I love the bulletin board material that went back and forth between Kevin McHale and Larry Bird and Bernard King from that era. So that was a fun rivalry. And then in the early part of this story, the Celtics again, but it was the Celtics of John Havlicek and Dave Cowens, kind of the old guard Celtics leaving, and people kind of forget about the period between the good Celtics teams of the mid '70s and the good Celtics teams of the Larry Bird era. Like the Celtics and Knicks both kind of sucked for a couple years in the late '70s, and so they had this rivalry of like, well, we're bad, but we're not Celtics bad. And so that was a fun rivalry to see that it continued through all phases of whether they were both good or both sucked. So yeah, their rivalry with the Celtics in a couple different iterations was a lot of fun.
Yeah, I think you hit it on that. And that kind of, again, not to keep beating on the theme here, but just appreciating these forgotten eras. Cause I think you're right with the Celtics. Like they did win post Bill Russell and Bob Cousy. Cause I think obviously those are the guys you go to right away, but they won with Havlicek and Cowens, down low for a while with the Knicks. But, obviously both bouncing back in the '90s. I want to go back to kind of the blend with music a little bit because it is all over this book. I mean, early rappers, you name it, Kool Herc, Africa Bambaataa, obviously a lot of Run DMC and Beastie Boys, kind of to the same token along the lines with learning about these guys and going back and appreciating this music again. Did you have, a particular artist that you gravitated to or one who you really enjoyed, who you have a greater appreciation for now post book coming out?
Sure, yeah. So one thing I'll plug is that my publishers actually put out a Spotify playlist that goes along with Kings of the Garden. So if you, I believe in Spotify, if you look either my name up or Kings of the Garden, it'll pull up this playlist that I helped them put together. That is just like, I'll put it on just like shuffle and do whatever, and it's actually a lot of fun to listen to. But in terms of your answer, it was a person like I respected and appreciated Grandmaster Flash and the Furious Five, but that was old school. So Grandmaster Flash, their song "The Message," which is a fantastic song. If you've not heard it, I'm sure listeners have heard the phrase. I'm close to the edge. I'm trying not to lose my head. Like that's an often quoted sampled phrase. I was 3 years old when that song came out, so like it wasn't in my wheelhouse until a lot later. And so going back and listening, like Grandmaster Flash was amazing. The Cold Crush Brothers from the documentary Wild Style, which was 1983. Again, I was a pretty young kid. Like that, those two groups especially, because it was to me Grandmaster Flash had this kind of deep, kind of insightful message again being delivered. The Cold Crush Brothers were more like the rapping to make things rhyme and sound cool, and it was a lot of fun to research. And I'd have colleagues that would walk by my office, and I've got old school rap just blaring out of my speakers, and they just kind of look at me and shrug and keep walking. But I've definitely grown an appreciation for a lot of that genre.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely, and all that production too, especially now, I feel like you're sampled. I mean, you mentioned The Message. It's like how many rappers at this point have rapped over The Message or sampled it? And it's like, you got to get an appreciation for the pioneers. That's just across the board, I think. Again, that's, why these books and these projects are so great. And so just going back into the structure of the book, each chapter basically focuses on a different particular season. And so it kind of recaps. And again, that's where the blend comes in, right? Like it has everything that happened with the Knicks. We're talking about trades at the end of every chapter. There's a fun little section where it's got all the leaders in case you just it's like a nice. It's like the I'm in law school right now. I just took evidence last semester. And so like they had these like fun little rule recaps at the end of it. I love them at the end of the chapter, like just going back and, seeing the big trades and just having that all nice in one place. Did you, kind of along the lines, these playoff series, did you have a year in particular that you really just felt either impact wise on the city or just like in terms of the Knicks team overall, just, being fun vibes wise that really stood out to you?
Yeah. So I would say the '84 team was they were a special team. That was the year they pushed the Celtics to 7 games in the Eastern Conference Finals. It was by far the best team that they fielded in this decade, and the city just rallied around them. And it was a situation where, not unlike the current Knicks product, like this is 40 years ago now. But like the city was so desperate for a team that was legitimately good and not just teasing them with, maybe a couple good games or whatever, that watching how the city rally around them in '84 was really special. And so that was the team that they seemed to be building to something. And then of course, the next season things go to, really go badly, but that was a year where there seemed to be hope. Like the city had turned around the bankruptcy thing. Rap hip hop had left the South Bronx and had become not only a citywide, but starting to become a nationwide phenomenon. Like that was a really exciting year. And it's right at the end of the book, which doesn't seem to make a lot of sense unless you realize what happened that went so badly in 1985 for the team. And then Ewing arriving that summer. But '84 was this like glimmer of hope in which the team, the city, everybody kind of was on the same page and rallied together.
Well, in a way, like, and you have to appreciate that, right? Like to get to that point, because it's such a, again, it's a big turnaround. Like it's probably because now it starts to be 45, 50 years ago. There isn't as much of an appreciation for that. You just see what New York is in 2024. You associate it with Wall Street. You don't think that the biggest city in America could potentially be dealing with a bankruptcy crisis. It's just kind of hard to believe, but yeah, I mean, I love New York. There's just something special about it. I lived there for 4 years. I say all the time that if the Knicks finally get over the hump and bring that championship home, because it's clearly been a long time now. It's been since the '70s that I can't fathom it. Like I know for me, I'm a Philadelphia fan. When the Eagles finally brought that first Super Bowl home, like it was different. Like I don't think the city, that whole summer, the city was just on one. Everyone was in a good mood. They were playing the Super Bowl randomly in the street, like on just like random days in July when the replay was on NFL Network. Like I think it'll be that sort of impact on New York whenever the Knicks get over the hump, and they're going to get over the hump one day. Like it's going to happen at some point. Obviously people are optimistic for that this year with them being the number 2 seed, but that's a whole different podcast. Going back to the interviews and the research that you did for this process, and that's again such a thoroughly researched book. You talk to former players, you talk to writers, kind of talk about that process a little bit. What was it like, via text messages, just meeting some of these people? Like what did you, are there any particular interviews? I know you mentioned one, but other ones that stood out, or what really were kind of your takeaways from talking to these people in this era?
Yeah. So 2 takeaways. One is, there were players I would have loved to have been able to talk to that I wasn't able to talk to. Right. So I wasn't able to talk to Spencer Haywood or Walt Frazier, or Earl Monroe. I did get Spencer Haywood on the phone one time, but he dismissed me pretty quick. He was busy or whatever, and that's fine. So on one hand, they're the people I'd have loved to talk to. On the other hand, like I got to have a phone conversation with Hubie Brown, and we talked for like 40 minutes, and he was amazing. Like he was the Mike Glenn, Jim Clemens and I, like we had a good connection. But like the most special had to be Hubie, because I mean, dude's in his 80s at the time, and we had a great conversation, and he was just like his mind was just a steel trap, and he could remember back 40 years ago to what he thought about some of these players, and like it was a lot of fun. I also had a great time talking to Bob McAdoo. He called me from a phone after he was an assistant coach with the Heat at the time. Called me from a Heat practice, like right after the practice, and was incredibly generous with his time. I talked to some non-Knicks actually. I talked to Dave Cowens for a little bit on the phone. That was fun. Some old Pacers players I talked to. So it was, everyone I talked to was gracious with their time, and so it was a lot of fun. I literally got off the phone with Hubie Brown and had to find somebody to talk to. I called my dad and was like, "Hey, I just got off the phone with Hubie Brown. We talked for like 40 minutes about basketball." It was definitely a highlight. So yeah, I mean the interviews were a lot of fun, and I really enjoyed again all of them in various ways, but especially probably Hubie.
No, I mean I love that, and that's the fun part of this, right? Like those moments where you still get to geek out and you get to talk to people that have had such an impact on all of us. Because at the end of the day, like we're all basketball fans, and so to
Right.
talk to these people and have them be great, like you mentioned, be gracious with their time and really help you out with this project, like that's an incredible feeling, and it shows. Like I mean, like I said, I loved seeing some of the Hoobie quotes in this book, and frankly, he's a guy that for all the basketball that I associate Hubie Brown with, like I do don't not really associate him with being the Knicks coach in the 70s. Like it is a forgotten era. Even Willis Reed, like he's such a defining player of that era, him coming out injured in that game 7 and inspiring them to victory and winning the championship there. And then you forget where it's like, oh yeah, he was the head coach there too for a little bit. Like that's just the fun part of reading this book. And I, like I said, I really enjoyed it. Spencer Haywood too. I wonder if he got the winning. Did you watch Winning Time by chance?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
I wonder if he got the winning time bump a little bit. Because I mean, that's a guy who I think, obviously it's a much more serious plot line in that show, with him dealing with addiction issues. And that's something the book talks a little bit as well. Not just with Spencer Haywood, but, unfortunately for both New York and for, the NBA, that was a major problem in the 70s and the 80s, like an almost, crippling problem for the league. Um, and I think the one thing that I mean, I don't know, did you gain as you were going back and watching all this footage of old Knicks basketball, and obviously towards the 80s it was coming around, but I mean, we were at a point where did you gain an appreciation for how or an extra appreciation for how far the league has come to from just a broadcast perspective? Like these games were on tape delay at one point.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, on a broadcast perspective, the announcers were fantastic still, and some of the films I watched did have the old commercials in there, so it was jarring to watch a Marlboro commercial or whatever during a game. No, the announcing was always good. The thing that was jarring was just the style of play, and so how every team played a little differently. And that's not to say that they don't now, but there's so much emphasis on, like the drive and dish, for example, in today's game that just wasn't as big a part of the game. That's not to say it was better or worse or anything, but that was really what was jarring. Is it wasn't necessarily how it was announced or presented so much as just the on-court product was different. Um, and that was true from the mid 70s to the mid 80s. Even when they added a 3-point line, like guys weren't shooting a lot of threes. I interviewed Kazi Russell, who played for the Knicks for a while, and he led the believe it was him. Yeah, led the NBA in 3-point percentage, but it only shot like 42 on the season or something obscene, which was, I mean, now wouldn't even get you qualified. But yeah, the style of play, the pace of play was very different. And so that was certainly jarring going back and watching old games.
Yeah, I mean, like you said, the 42 threes on the entire season, and this is when they're merging with the ABA, of course, and bringing that wrinkle into the game. And we do, I think, a lot of these guys, mention it, not to get off the Knicks for a little bit, but even Larry Bird, like we think of Larry Bird as one of the better shooters of all time, rightfully so. But I think we associate him with some reason for like being this prolific 3-point marksman when it's like, yeah, he was shooting, but he wasn't really shooting like that. Like it is such a radically different game. But, bringing it back to the Knicks and just with all this, what do you think it is about this team that has just stuck with the Metro the way it has? Because it is, they're the ultimate unifying sports force in the city. And there truly is just something special in the energy. Like, I was blessed to live there during Linsanity, and I remember that. And obviously, like, that was in the middle of the regulars, like that was in springtime.
Mhm.
What do you think it is about this franchise that has really just, ingrained itself into the fabric of New York City?
Yeah. So first of all, I was thinking, I was like, it's not Cassie Russell. It was Campy Russell. Cassie Russell was there in the early '70s. Campy was there in the late '70s. Close enough name. I'll take the L there.
You got to pull that
But
on Immaculate Grid one week for sure.
yeah, right, exactly. Um, so as far as like the team's connection, one thing I found is that, and I guess I knew this going in, but it's that New Yorkers, by and large, from the earliest days, they're balling. Like they're out in the streets. One of the other things I talk some about is the playground ball that's so important to the city. Is like basketball is not just a thing that you watch the Knicks do. Basketball is a thing that you do, and whether you're actually playing or not, like courts are everywhere, and it's hard to walk in New York City without seeing basketball of some sort, right? Not only that, but like the high school basketball played there is at such a high level. Back in the '70s and '80s, the college basketball there used to be at a really high level. I know it's not necessarily the case now with teams around the city, but like basketball was just at all levels was so incredibly important. And then even like if you weren't into basketball itself, like sneaker culture and music was connected to basketball. So it seemed like basketball is so pervasive that the Knicks being the best expression of that meant that the Knicks were almost put on a pedestal. And so I think that, that still exists to a point today where it's like basketball just in general is so important to many New Yorkers that therefore the Knicks are important to many New Yorkers. And so you mentioned Linsanity. That's a fantastic era in Knicks history, although it was brief. The Ewing era, the blood on the horns, Garden era of the 1990s and the rivalry with Riley and the Heat. Like there's all these eras, like there's the Carmelo era, where people thought, Carmelo and Tyson Chandler and whoever else could bring home a championship. One other thing that I found that was really interesting was that like from the 1970s, so they won their last title in '73. There was always this sense like the Knicks are going to bring in this superstar that's going to bring them to the promised land. And so I thought, like, before I did research on this, I thought that was like a KD LeBron kind of thing. But no, I mean, this is from the 1970s. Like they thought Wilt Chamberlain was going to maybe come and be a Knick, and all this Kareem Abdul-Jabbar might, join his hometown and take his talents to Manhattan or whatever. And so like seeing that continuity is also a big part of like what it means to be a Knicks fan, I think.
Yeah, there is. You're right. I think you hit it on the head because they're in such a unique position in that the Knicks will always get a franchise or get a meeting with any major free agent just because they're the New York Knicks. Like it's New York City, there will always be that draw. But you're right. Like overall, I mean, Patrick Ewing was hometown. He was drafted. Carmelo Anthony is the only one, and they traded for him to bring him back. That wasn't even a free agency signing. Like they've had some, you got Amari Stoudemire. And now obviously the Jalen Brunson signing has been phenomenal for them. And he's, looks like for all intents and purposes about to show out in these playoffs, really tough first round series with the Sixers. But, this is definitely a team that's captured the city's attention. It is, there's no way to say it. They ride and die around this team. And then again, I think that's why, that's why I loved having, or love that this book is coming out now. It's a really, I think, fitting time to drop with New York basketball being back the way it is. But it was I was laughing during the Kareem things. Like it was. It's like these poor Knicks fans have been doing this for years. But again, that speaks to the dedication, right? Like what a team that, or what a fan base, I should say, that has just continued to sell out and be dedicated. And frankly, at least in the 2000s. I mean, not less during the time period about this book, but there's been a lot of times that they maybe necessarily shouldn't have, or haven't had the reason. No one would blame them, I guess, if they jumped ship, is what I'm trying to say.
Sure.
The one thing you did mention, because I always got to ask this because I'm a super sucker, because you mentioned obviously Tecmo NBA, but you mentioned NBA Jam as well. Great combo with the Knicks. I was a sucker for Indiana too. I'm not going to lie. Like Reggie Miller, you get Smits, you get Detlef Schrempf was there too. Who's your favorite NBA Jam combo? Because I truly believe that's maybe the greatest basketball game ever.
Wow. I mean, that's like asking me to name my favorite kid. Um, so I actually I loved NBA Jam. NBA Jam Tournament Edition even turned it up a notch. It was tough because those were two of the squads I ran with because Reggie could shoot threes and Smits obviously was a big guy. Schrempf was all right. And then on the Knicks side, you had some combination of Starks, Oakley, Ewing that could kind of present the same matchup problems. Um, Man, that's a tough one because then you also had the Seattle combo of Kemp and Kemp and Peyton.
Yeah,
Um,
nasty.
the Bulls were nerfed a little bit by not having Jordan, so you
Yeah,
had
the major player, only maybe the greatest basketball player ever missing in that game. No, nothing to say about that.
oh yeah, no. I think I mentioned it in the book, but is that the Beastie Boys were playable characters, and so you could run out with the Beastie Boys, which was always fun. But yeah, I would say the Knicks were probably my go-to on NBA Jam because they were again you could anybody trying to bring a dunk to the rim, Ewing was going to at least knock them down. So yeah, fantastic game, still one of my favorites.
Yeah, it's legit. Like, I don't have a Super Nintendo currently. I did have one growing up, but it's legit. If one is working, because they're, now you have these like retro arcade bars and stuff like that. But if they've got NBA Jam, or if, obviously if you run into the real arcade simulator setup, then that's, whole different, it's gloves off, then we're getting after it. But yeah, what a game. Adam Creeblay at Adam Creeblay on Twitter. That's Criblez. Make sure you give him a follow. Of course, he is the history professor at Southeast Missouri State University, or one of the history professors there. Author of Tall Tales and Short Shorts. And again, get the book, Kings of the Garden, the New York Knicks and their city. Right now, it's out everywhere. I know this is like all over the camera right now, but go and get it. It's great. Adam, where can the people get the book? And tell me more about the playlist on Spotify too. Where can people pick it up, and how can they get the full audio experience as well?
Yeah, so Amazon, Barnes & Noble, kind of those places. It's available online. Should be in bookstores, actually, physical copies. Hopefully in the coming weeks, if not there already. Or you can go to the press that published it was Three Hills, which is Cornell. So if you type in Cribley Cornell, it'll pull up there. There's a Kindle version if you prefer the ebook, and there's an Audible version in the works. So you should be able to get the audiobook sometime in the next couple months. And then the Spotify playlist, yeah, if you search Kings of the Garden, it should pull up, or again my name, it should pull up as the Spotify playlist, which I help curate with my publicist, and it's fantastic. Like, again, throw it on repeat, throw it on shuffle, and it'll get you through a good day. So. Yeah.
Listen, you don't got to tell me twice, and I don't want to get too far ahead of it because, again, people need to get the book Kings of the Garden right now. Definitely go check that out. But because you said the idea for this book came during Tall Tales and Short Shorts, you got any ideas you're working on or you got ideas in the tank for a potential future book while you're working on this one?
I don't, honestly. To me, the 70s book was going to be a one-off, and this came about from it. I've got too many ideas. That's the problem. Is I love the NBA from the end of the 60s until about the mid 80s. There have been some fantastic books done on kind of the 80s and into the 90s. So I'll have to find my niche, but definitely not done writing about basketball, and definitely not done writing about pro basketball in this era.
Well, regardless, job well done, my friend. Kings of the Garden, the New York Knicks in their city. The book by Adam Creeblay is out now. Like you said, get it wherever you get your books. Kindle version is out as well, so definitely check that out. Thank you, everybody, for listening to this episode of the Drive and Dish NBA podcast. Appreciate you guys, as always. Find us wherever you get your podcasts. Watch the show on YouTube, and we will be back soon.